Jake Thompson seemed to have the perfect life at Jefferson High School in Ohio. He was the captain of the football team, the guy everyone admired, always surrounded by friends, with a charming smile that could win over any crowd. To his classmates, Jake had it all: popularity, athletic talent, and confidence. He walked the halls like he owned them, with his Letterman jacket slung casually over his shoulder and a confident stride that made people step aside. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the flawless image lay a life unraveling at the seams. At home, Jake lived in a war zone. His parents' voices echoed through the thin walls of their two-story house every night, their arguments escalating into vicious exchanges. Sometimes he would sit in his room, headphones on, trying to drown out the shouts with blaring music, but the noise always found a way in. The cracks in his family's foundation had become canyons, and Jake felt himself slipping into the void. The pressure to keep up the perfect image gnawed at him. At school, he wore a mask of confidence and control. But the truth was, Jake didn't know how to handle the storm inside him. The anger, the frustration, it had to go somewhere. So, he let it out the only way he knew how, by controlling others. Cruelty became his armor. If he couldn't control the chaos at home, he would control the narrative at school. Being feared meant being respected. Vulnerability was weakness, and Jake refused to be weak. His friends followed his lead, feeding off the toxic energy. Together, they set the tone at Jefferson High, a tone that left little room for weakness or difference. It all came to a head one night after another explosive argument between his parents. The walls seemed to vibrate with their voices. Plates shattered, accusations flew. Jake sat on the stairs, his hands gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, something inside him snapped. He stormed into the living room, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If you're going to keep fighting like this, why don't you just get a divorce already?" The room fell silent. His mother's face crumpled, tears spilling over. "You don't understand, Jake. We're trying to protect you." Her voice cracked, heavy with emotion, but Jake wasn't listening anymore. The words echoed in his mind, swirling with resentment and confusion. Protect him? From what? From the wreckage they had made of their lives? He turned, storming out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't care. The truth was, Jake wasn't running away from them. He was running from himself. The next day at school, Jake was back in character. He needed control. He needed to remind everyone who he was. The football field was his domain, the cafeteria, his stage. And then Eli Morales appeared, the new kid, quiet, reserved. With his simple clothes and strong accent, Eli stood out without trying. Jake noticed him immediately. Here was a new target, someone who didn't fit into the carefully constructed world Jake dominated, someone who wouldn't fight back. His friends noticed too. Tyler nudged him during lunch, nodding toward Eli. "Look at the new guy. Bet he doesn't even know how things work around here." Jake smirked. "Guess I'll have to teach him." It wasn't about Eli. It never was. It was about Jake proving he was still in control, that he wasn't the broken kid from the night before. Jake's laughter echoed across the cafeteria as he plotted his next move. Being feared meant no one questioned him. But Jake had no idea that Eli Morales wasn't just another quiet kid trying to fit in. Eli carried with him a past far heavier than anything Jake could imagine. Scars deeper than high school taunts. As Jake watched Eli walk alone, he felt a familiar satisfaction at the prospect of asserting his power. Yet, in the shadows of that cafeteria, the day was already beginning to shift. What Jake didn't know was that his carefully constructed world was about to unravel. The new kid wouldn't be just another target. Eli Morales would be the force that changed everything. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual midday chaos, laughter, conversations, and the clatter of trays. Jake Thompson sat at his usual spot, the center of attention, surrounded by his loyal group. His laughter echoed confident and sharp, as if the world revolved around him, but his eyes were elsewhere. Across the room, Eli Morales walked in, holding a lunch tray, scanning the crowded tables for an empty seat. His posture was quiet but steady, his eyes calm despite the unfamiliarity of the surroundings. Jake watched him closely, that familiar smirk creeping onto his face. Eli didn't belong here, not in Jake's world. The new kid looked like the perfect opportunity, a chance for Jake to reassert his dominance after a night spent feeling powerless. The urge to remind everyone who controlled the room surged within him. Jake leaned in toward Tyler, his closest friend and enabler, lowering his voice just enough for the group to hear. "Look at the new guy. Think he even knows how to survive." "Yeah," Tyler laughed, nudging him. "Show him how it's done, man. The stage is yours." Jake pushed back his chair with a loud screech that caught the attention of nearby tables. Conversations dimmed as heads turned. People expected something. Jake Thompson was about to perform. With a practiced grin, he raised his voice, ensuring everyone heard him. "Hey, new kid! Yeah, you! Come here for a second." The cafeteria quieted further, curiosity and anticipation hanging in the air. Eli paused, but didn't flinch. Slowly, he turned to face Jake, his expression unreadable. The two locked eyes across the room. Jake with his confident smirk, Eli with a calm stare that didn't waver. Jake motioned for him to come closer. "So, tell us, where exactly did you come from? Some jungle or desert we've never heard of." Laughter erupted from Jake's table. His friends howled, slapping each other's backs. A few students at nearby tables chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in. But most sat in stunned silence, watching to see how Eli would react. Yet Eli didn't react the way Jake expected. There was no flash of anger, no look of shame or embarrassment. Instead, Eli stepped forward, his eyes still locked with Jake's. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "I forgive you." The words weren't loud, but the impact was immediate. The room fell silent, as if the air had been sucked out. Jake stared, his smirk fading as confusion flickered across his face. Eli continued, his gaze unwavering. "You must be going through something hard to feel like you need to hurt others." The quiet in the cafeteria was deafening. Chairs stopped, scraping. Conversations halted. Jake stood frozen, unable to find a response. His carefully maintained confidence cracked for the first time. Eli turned and walked away, leaving Jake rooted in place. As the crowd slowly returned to their meals, whispers rippled through the room. Jake remained standing, staring after Eli, the echo of those words, "I forgive you," hammering in his head. For the first time, the laughter wasn't with him. The cafeteria no longer felt like his stage. Instead, it felt like a spotlight had been turned on him, exposing everything he had tried so hard to hide. The rest of lunch passed in a blur. Jake sat down eventually, silent as his friends tried to laugh off the awkward moment. But he wasn't listening. His mind replayed Eli's words over and over. "I forgive you." No one had ever responded to him like that. No anger, no humiliation, just forgiveness. It was disarming, unsettling. Jake didn't know how to process it. The afternoon dragged. Teachers droned on, but Jake couldn't concentrate. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. He had humiliated countless kids before. Some had cried, some had lashed out, but none had looked at him like Eli did. None had said those words. Why? The question gnawed at him. Why hadn't Eli fought back? Why had he forgiven him so easily? When the final bell rang, Jake didn't head to practice right away. Instead, he wandered the hallways, hoping to catch a glimpse of Eli. But Eli was nowhere to be seen. The school felt different now, the air heavier. The glances Jake received from other students weren't the admiring looks he was used to. They were questioning, judging. For the first time, Jake felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Guilt. At home that night, the usual shouting match between his parents erupted. Jake sat in his room, staring at the ceiling, headphones resting on his lap instead of blaring music. He couldn't block out the noise tonight. His mother's voice, breaking, with tears echoed through the walls. His father's sharp words followed, but louder than all of it were Eli's words from earlier. "I forgive you." Jake squeezed his eyes shut. The more he tried to push the memory away, the clearer it became. Those words didn't just sound like forgiveness, they sounded like understanding. And that terrified him, because Jake didn't want to be understood. He didn't want anyone seeing the cracks beneath his mask. Vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant losing control. And Jake Thompson refused to lose control. But deep down, a part of him knew that control had already started slipping the moment Eli Morales walked into Jefferson High. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, the faint glow of his phone screen fading in and out as unread messages piled up. His friends were still laughing about lunch, joking about the show he put on. But Jake didn't respond. The words kept replaying in his head, "I forgive you." Each time, they echoed louder, heavier, dragging him down. Forgiveness wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like a weight pressing on his chest. Eli's calm voice, so steady and sure, haunted him. No anger, no fear, just quiet understanding. It unsettled Jake more than any retaliation would have. For the first time in years, Jake questioned himself, "Why do I even do this?" The question gnawed at him, twisting in his mind like a blade. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The next morning, Jefferson High felt different. The usual buzz of conversations seemed quieter. The stares Jake received were no longer admiring or respectful. They were uncertain, questioning. Whispers followed him through the halls. Jake Thompson, the untouchable, had been left speechless, and everyone had seen it. He walked faster, head held high, trying to shake the gnawing feeling of doubt creeping up his spine. But no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't outrun the weight of those words. "I forgive you." Why had Eli forgiven him? What kind of person does that? The thought was suffocating. Jake wasn't used to being the one left without control. During football practice, his mind wasn't on the field. Plays he normally executed flawlessly slipped through his fingers. His throws were off. His timing was late. Coach Carter barked his name more times than Jake could count. "Get your head in the game, Thompson." But Jake couldn't focus. He saw Eli's face every time he closed his eyes. Calm, collected, as if Jake's attempt to humiliate him had barely left a scratch. Why didn't he fight back? That question pounded in Jake's head with every failed pass. Tyler gave him a look during practice, a look that said, "What's wrong with you?" But Jake shrugged it off, pretending everything was fine. He didn't need anyone seeing the cracks. He couldn't let them know that for the first time, he wasn't sure of his place. After practice, Jake wandered the empty halls, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He didn't want to go home. Home meant listening to his parents scream at each other, blaming one another for things Jake stopped caring about long ago. The fighting never ended, and he couldn't stand the idea of being trapped in that noise again. Instead, he found himself drifting toward the library. It was mostly empty at this time of day. Quiet. A place he rarely visited. But something drew him there. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. Jake wasn't sure. What he did know was that he needed answers. He needed to understand the boy who had shattered his sense of control with a single sentence. As he stepped inside, the quiet hum of conversation reached his ears. Jake froze. He recognized the voices. Mr. Reynolds, the history teacher, spoke softly. "Eli, how are you adjusting? Is everything all right?" There was a pause. Jake edged closer, staying out of sight. Eli's voice came next, calm but carrying a weight Jake hadn't noticed before. It's difficult, but compared to what I've seen, this place is a paradise. The words struck Jake like a punch. Compared to what I've seen, he leaned against the bookshelf, his breath caught in his throat. What had Eli seen? The cafeteria scene flashed through his mind. His jokes, the laughter of his friends, Eli's, a calm response. And now this. The pieces didn't fit together. Jake left the library, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. Eli wasn't just another kid trying to survive high school. There was more, much more. For the first time, Jake realized he knew nothing about the boy he had tried to break. The guilt gnawed deeper now. He had humiliated someone who had clearly been through more than he could imagine. And all for what? Control, respect. Jake wasn't sure anymore. His stomach twisted at the thought. This wasn't like the other times. This wasn't a harmless joke. It felt bigger, more real, more wrong. That night, Jake sat in his room, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He didn't know why he was doing it, but something compelled him. He typed, Syria, civil war, refugees, the search results. Hit him harder than he expected. Images of destroyed cities, families torn apart, children standing among rubble, their faces blank, hollow. Jake stared at the screen, his throat tight. This is what Eli came from. His chest felt like it was caving in. Eli had lived through this. And Jake, spoiled, angry, broken, had tried to tear him down for being different, for being quiet, for existing. The realization hit like a tidal wave. A deep, hollow shame settled in his bones. Jake Thompson, captain of the football team, the boy who had everything, had humiliated a survivor. No apology could fix that, but he had to try. History class dragged on as Jake slouched in his chair, staring at the whiteboard without seeing it. His mind wasn't on the lesson. It hadn't been for days. Ever since that moment in the cafeteria, I forgive you, those 3 words had been lodged in his brain like a splinter he couldn't remove. He tried to shake it off, but the gnawing guilt lingered. Jake Thompson, the guy who had always held control, who dictated the social hierarchy of Jefferson High, felt unsteady for the first time. His mask of confidence had started to slip, and the worst part was, he didn't know how to fix it. Mr. Reynolds' voice broke through his haze. The teacher's lecture had shifted to global conflicts and humanitarian crises. He clicked through a slideshow filled with images, ruined cities, displaced families, children sitting in rubble. And here we see the aftermath of the Syrian civil war, Mr. Reynolds explained, his tone somber. A conflict that has displaced millions and cost countless lives. These images remind us of the realities many face beyond our borders. Jake's gaze drifted lazily to the front, but then something caught his attention. In the row ahead, Eli Morales sat still. His back was straight, his eyes fixed on the screen, but there was something in his expression. Jake leaned forward, slightly, narrowing his eyes. Eli's hands were clenched into tight fists on his desk. His jaw was set. The normally calm and collected new kid looked distant, as if his mind had been transported elsewhere. Jake wasn't sure why, but the sight unsettled him. As the lesson continued, Jake kept watching. Every time the slideshow showed images of destroyed neighborhoods and families fleeing, Eli seemed to withdraw further, his face emotionless, but his body rigid. Jake's stomach twisted. Why is he reacting like that? After class, Jake hung back near the doorway. He hadn't planned to stay, but curiosity gnawed at him. He needed to know what was going on. That's when he heard it. Mr. Reynolds approached, Eli with a concerned smile. "Hey, Eli, how are you holding up? Adjusting okay?" Eli nodded slowly, his gaze still avoiding the teacher's. "It's hard sometimes," he said, voice low but steady. "But compared to what I've seen, this place is a paradise." Jake froze. The words echoed in his mind. compared to what I've seen. Mr. Reynolds patted Eli's shoulder. If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. Eli gave a polite nod and gathered his things. Jake turned away before Eli could see him watching, his thoughts spinning. What did he mean by that? What has he seen? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jake barely spoke during lunch, ignoring the jabs from his friends about being quieter than usual. After school, he skipped football practice for the first time all year. Instead, he found himself sitting in the library, hunched over a computer. He wasn't sure why he cared, but something in Eli's words had struck a chord. Opening the search engine, Jake typed, "Syrian Civil War Stories." The screen filled with articles, photos, and videos. He clicked on one. For the next hour, Jake read about families forced to flee their homes, children living in refugee camps, entire cities reduced to ashes. The images were worse than anything he'd imagined. One photograph made him pause. A group of boys, older than him, standing among the rubble. Their faces were hollow, their eyes carrying stories of things no teenager should witness. Jake leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Eli lived through this. It hit him harder than he expected. Eli wasn't just some quiet new kid with a funny accent. He had survived something Jake couldn't even comprehend, and Jake had humiliated him. The weight of what he had done pressed down on his chest. He wasn't just a bully anymore. He was cruel in a way that made him sick to his stomach. For once, Jake didn't know how to fix it. A simple apology felt meaningless. "Sorry I made fun of you after you survived a war." The words sounded hollow even in his mind. He needed to do something more. But what? That night at home, Jake sat, alone in his room. The familiar sounds of his parents arguing drifted up from downstairs, but for once, he didn't react. He was too distracted. His phone buzzed. A text from Tyler. "Yo, where were you after school? Don't flake on us, man." Jake stared at the screen before tossing the phone aside. For the first time, he didn't care. The usual distractions, football, popularity, jokes at others' expense, none of it mattered. The look on Eli's face in class haunted him, the way Eli had said those words, "I forgive you." How could someone who had been through so much forgive him so easily? Jake realized something then. Eli wasn't weak. Eli Morales might just be the strongest person Jake had ever met, and he needed to understand him. Jake Thompson had always believed he knew everything about everyone at Jefferson High, but Eli Morales was a mystery Jake suddenly felt desperate to solve. Jake spotted Eli sitting under a large oak tree in the courtyard, a worn book resting in his hands. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across Eli's face. He looked calm, absorbed in the pages before him, completely unaware of Jake's presence. Jake hesitated. Approaching him felt heavier than any confrontation he'd had on the football field. He had been the king of this school for years, feared and admired. Apologizing, genuinely apologizing, was foreign territory, but this wasn't just any apology. After learning the truth about Eli's past, Jake knew the damage he had caused couldn't be brushed away with a few words. His fists clenched at his sides as he took a deep breath and forced his legs to move. "Hey, Eli." His voice came, out rougher than he intended. Eli didn't look up. His fingers continued to trace the page, as if Jake wasn't standing there at all. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, he started, but Eli cut him off without lifting his gaze. "It's fine. I already told you. I forgive you." The words were flat this time, lacking the compassion they had carried before. Eli finally looked up, his dark eyes calm but guarded. There was no anger there, no bitterness, just exhaustion. As if he had spent too long expecting disappointment, the weight of that gaze hit Jake harder than any punch. "No, it's not fine. Jake said quickly, the words spilling out. "You don't get it. I didn't know. I didn't realize." His voice faltered. "How could he say this right? I didn't realize you survived something worse than anything I could imagine, and I made you a target anyway." The shame twisted in his chest. Eli closed his book with a soft thump and stood up, his gaze steady. "You don't know me, Jake, and I don't think you want to. For you, I'm just another face, another target. But for me, this school, this place, it's supposed to be a new beginning." His voice didn't rise, but the words hit Jake like a slap. "And you ruined that." Jake swallowed hard. He deserved that, every word of it. He had nothing to say in his defense, but he couldn't just walk away, not now. "You're right," Jake admitted, lowering his head. "I didn't know you, I didn't want to, but I do now. Or at least, I want to try." Eli's face remained unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the leaves above them. "Why?" Eli asked, voice softer, but edged with skepticism. Jake didn't have a rehearsed answer. He just knew the truth. "Because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I need to stop being the kind of person I've been." Before Eli could respond, a voice interrupted. "Thompson Morales!" It was Mr. Reynolds, striding across the courtyard with a stack of papers in hand. "Glad I found you two. I've got news." Jake and Eli exchanged a quick glance. "Principal Carter's assigning a special project on overcoming adversity, pairs, and guess who got matched up?" Mr. Reynolds grinned, handing them a packet. Jake stared at the words on the cover. Personal journeys, stories of strength. Eli raised an eyebrow, finally breaking eye contact. "Really? Us?" Mr. Reynolds shrugged. "Fate works in strange ways." As the teacher walked off, Jake couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Looks like we're stuck together." Eli didn't smile. "Stuck? Or given a second chance?" His tone was unreadable, but Jake caught the subtle shift. As the sun dipped, lower in the sky, they sat back under the oak tree, flipping through the project guidelines. The silence between them wasn't as uncomfortable as before. Jake glanced at Eli, wondering what stories lay behind that calm exterior. "So, where do we start?" Jake asked, genuinely this time. Eli didn't look up from the packet. "We start by being honest." His voice was steady, certain. Jake nodded. Honesty, something he hadn't practiced in a long time. But maybe this project wasn't just a school assignment. Maybe it was the chance he didn't know he needed to understand. Eli, to make things right and to finally face himself. Working on the project with Eli wasn't easy. The first few sessions were filled with awkward silences, broken only by brief, forced conversations about the assignment. Jake tried to bridge the gap with small talk, but Eli remained distant, responding with short answers and keeping his eyes on the pages they were supposed to complete. The weight of the past still lingered between them, a wall Jake couldn't seem to break through. Yet he kept trying. He stayed late after practice, showed up early before class, hoping that eventually Eli would see he was serious about changing. But the distance remained. Eli wasn't cold or rude, he was simply closed off, like a door Jake didn't have the key to. Jake couldn't blame him. After everything he had done, why would Eli believe he was genuine now? One afternoon, as they sat together in the library working on the project outline, Jake finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Hey, Eli," he began hesitantly. "This project is supposed to be about overcoming adversity, right? Personal stories and all that." Eli didn't look up from his notes. "Yeah, so?" Jake swallowed hard. "Well, I mean, you mentioned before that you've seen things, stuff that I can't even imagine." Eli's pen stilled on the paper. The air between them seemed to tighten. Jake pressed on, his voice softer this time. "What happened? Back where you're from?" For a moment, Jake thought Eli wouldn't answer. The silence stretched so long that Jake considered taking the question back. But then, slowly, Eli set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, staring at a spot on the wall as if remembering something distant. "I was playing outside with my friends," Eli began, his voice calm but distant. "We were laughing, running, around like kids do, and then—" He paused, his fingers curling slightly against the edge of the table. "There was this sound, like thunder, but it wasn't thunder." His gaze dropped, his voice lowering. "The building behind us exploded. One moment we were there together, and the next, everything was gone. Just dust, screams." Jake felt his stomach twist. He couldn't find any words. Eli continued, his tone steady but hollow. "I don't remember how long I ran. Days, maybe. Weeks. My family didn't make it. I came here because there was nowhere else to go." He looked back at Jake, his expression unreadable. "That's why I don't care about your jokes. I've seen real fear, real loss. Words, they don't hurt the same." Jake sat frozen, the weight of Eli's story crashing down on him. All the dumb jokes, the cruel comments, the humiliation. It all felt even more monstrous now. How could he have been so blind, so shallow? He realized he wasn't just trying to apologize for bullying Eli. He was trying to redeem himself for not seeing the human being behind the silence. "I don't know what to say," Jake admitted finally, his voice rough. "Sorry doesn't feel like enough," Eli shrugged. "Maybe it isn't, but sometimes people don't want words. They want actions." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. The wall between them had cracked, just a little. Over the next few days, things began to shift. Jake noticed small changes. Eli would offer a comment or two about the project without being asked. He no longer avoided eye contact. They started working side by side without the crushing weight of tension. Jake found himself looking forward to their sessions, not just for the project, but for the chance to understand more about the person Eli was. Yet, despite the progress, Jake knew that proving he had truly changed would take more than a few study sessions and half-hearted apologies. He needed to show Eli and himself that he could be better. He had to be willing to lose everything he thought mattered to gain the trust he didn't know he needed. The day of the project presentation arrived sooner than Jake expected. The classroom buzzed with chatter as students prepared to share their stories. Jake sat at his desk, tapping his fingers nervously against the wood. For weeks, he and Eli had worked together, slowly building trust, sharing pieces of themselves, but this presentation felt like the final test. Their project wasn't just an assignment, it was the culmination of everything they'd been through, together and separately. Jake glanced at Eli, sitting beside him, his expression calm as always, though his fingers drummed lightly on the pages of their report. Jake admired how Eli could remain so composed. After everything, Eli still carried himself with quiet strength. Jake wished he had that kind of control. The truth was, he was terrified, not of speaking in front of the class, he'd done that countless times, but of what this moment represented. He wanted to prove he had changed, to show Eli and everyone else that he was no longer the person who used cruelty as a shield. But deep down, a part of him still wondered, would anyone believe him? As Mr. Reynolds called them to the front, Jake stood, forcing his legs to move. The classroom fell quiet, all eyes turning toward them. Jake could feel the weight of their gazes, his old friends, teammates, people he'd spent years trying to impress. Tyler sat near the back, smirking as if expecting a performance. Jake swallowed hard. This is it, he thought. No turning back. Eli began first, his voice steady as he spoke about his journey. The room remained silent, hanging on his every word. Jake watched as Eli shared his story, not all the details, but enough. The silence after he finished was heavy, respectful. No one laughed. No one dared to. Then it was Jake's turn. He stepped forward, gripping the edge of the podium. His palms were sweaty. His throat felt tight. He glanced at Eli, who gave him the faintest nod. Jake took a deep breath. I used to think being strong meant being on top, controlling everything, controlling people. His voice echoed in the still room. I thought respect came from fear. But I was wrong. He paused, letting the words sink in. I hurt people because I didn't know how to handle my own problems. I hid behind jokes, bullying, because I didn't want anyone to see how broken I really was. The room was utterly still. Jake felt their eyes on him, but he didn't falter. He couldn't. Then Eli came along, and I did what I always did. I tried to make him small so I could feel big. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed on. But Eli isn't small. He's the strongest person I've ever met. Not because he fights back, but because he doesn't need to. Because he forgave me when I didn't deserve it. Jake turned slightly, looking at Eli. This project isn't about me teaching anything. It's about me learning. Learning from someone who survived things I'll never understand. Someone who showed me what real strength looks like. Before Jake could continue, a voice from the back interrupted. So what? The bully's a good guy now? Tyler's voice dripped with sarcasm. Laughter rippled through the room, uncertain at first, then growing. Jake froze. His heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had dreaded. The old Jake would have laughed it off, cracked a joke, shifted the attention back to someone else. But he wasn't that person anymore. He couldn't be. Jake turned back toward Tyler, his jaw tightening. No, he said firmly, loud enough for the entire class to hear. I'm not a good guy, not yet. But I'm trying to be. The room went silent again. Tyler's smirk faded. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The hardest part was over. Jake looked at Eli again. For the first time, Eli smiled. Small, but real. The kind of smile that said, I see you. I believe you. Jake stepped back from the podium, letting the quiet linger. The room remained still. Then, slowly, someone began clapping. It was Ashley. Others joined. Soon, the entire class was applauding. Jake didn't know what to do with the sound. For years, he'd thrived on attention, on being the center of it all. But this felt different. The applause wasn't for the mask he wore. It was for him, who he was trying to become. As they returned to their seats, Eli leaned in slightly. You did good, he said quietly. Jake exhaled, relief washing over him. Couldn't have done it without you, he replied. The tension between them was gone. The wall had crumbled. For the first time in a long time, Jake Thompson felt like he was standing on solid ground. The applause from the classroom still echoed in Jake's mind as he walked home, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. He knew deep down that his moment of honesty during the presentation wasn't enough. Words were easy. Actions, though, actions mattered. He kept replaying the moment Tyler mocked him, how the class had hesitated before clapping. Were they applauding because they believed him, or because it was expected? The doubt gnawed at him. Eli's quiet nod of approval had meant the world, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he still hadn't done enough. Apologies and presentations wouldn't erase the years he spent hurting others. Changing wasn't just about saying the right things. It was about being ready to lose everything that had once defined him. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that. The following morning, the entire school gathered in the gym for an assembly on bullying awareness. Jake had known about the event, but he hadn't expected to be involved. Yet there he was, sitting beside Eli in the front row as Mr. Reynolds approached them before the assembly started. Jake, Eli, there's been a last-minute change. Principal Carter wants you two to speak about your project. She thinks your story could make a difference. Jake's stomach sank. Speaking in front of the class had been hard enough. Speaking in front of the entire school? That was another level. He glanced at Eli, who gave him a small shrug. Guess we're doing this, Eli said simply. Jake tried to smile, but his mind raced. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to prove he had changed. But what if he failed? As they stood backstage waiting for their turn, Jake heard the familiar voices of his teammates, Tyler's laugh louder than the rest. "You really think Thompson's gonna pull this off? The guy's a joke. No way he's actually changed." The words stung more than Jake wanted to admit. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Ignore it. Prove them wrong. The principal's voice echoed through the gym, introducing them. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he and Eli stepped onto the stage. Hundreds of faces stared back at them. The lights felt hotter, the room quieter. This wasn't just another speech. This was it. The real test. Eli began speaking, his voice steady as always, sharing a condensed version of their project. The audience listened intently, moved by Eli's story. Jake stood beside him, waiting for his turn, but when Eli finished and stepped back, giving him the floor, Jake felt that familiar fear creeping in. What if he wasn't enough? What if everything he said sounded fake? He swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. "I used to think I had everything figured out," Jake began, his voice echoing through the gym. "Captain of the football team, friends, popularity. But the truth is, I didn't have control. I was falling apart, and I took it out on others, on Eli." He paused, glancing at Eli. "I wanted to feel strong, so I made others feel small. But Eli showed me what real strength looks like." Jake's voice wavered, but he didn't. "Stop. I bullied someone who had survived more than I could ever imagine. I thought I had problems, but Eli faced real loss, real pain. And when I tried to tear him down, he forgave me." He looked out at the crowd. "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve. It's something you earn, and I haven't earned it yet. But I'm trying." The gym was silent. Jake glanced toward the back of the room, where Tyler and the rest of his old friends stood. Tyler smirked, shaking his head, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Still pretending, huh? Guess you'll do anything for attention." Laughter echoed again, this time sharper. Jake froze. The moment stretched. The entire school seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the moment that would define who he really was. Jake turned slowly to face Tyler, the old instinct urging him to laugh it off, to make a joke, to protect the fragile image he had spent years building. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "You're right, Tyler. I did a lot of things for attention, but not anymore." His voice didn't shake this time. "If standing up here means losing the approval of people who cheered me on when I was hurting others, then so be it. I'd rather stand alone for the right reasons than with a crowd for the wrong ones." The gym fell into stunned silence. Tyler's smirk faltered. For the first time, Jake Thompson felt the fear lift. He had said what needed to be said, regardless of the consequences. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. Slowly, more joined. Soon the entire gym erupted in applause. Jake stood there, breathless, as the realization hit him. This applause wasn't for the captain of the football team. It wasn't for the mask he had worn for so long. It was for him, for the person he was trying to become. Eli stepped forward, standing beside him. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. They stood together, united not by a shared past, but by the future they were building. The noise in the gym blurred around Jake as he finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't out of reach. The applause from the gym faded, but its echo remained with Jake long after the assembly ended. For the first time, he had stood in front of the entire school, not as the untouchable football captain, not as the guy who hid behind jokes and cruelty, but as himself, vulnerable, honest. The applause had felt real, yet Jake knew that the journey wasn't over. One speech wouldn't erase the years of damage he'd caused. Words were easy, lasting change required more. As he walked through the crowded hallways, some students nodded at him with cautious approval, others whispered, and a few still gave skeptical glances. The hardest part, however, wasn't the judgment of strangers. It was the silence from Tyler and his old friends. The group that once followed him everywhere barely acknowledged his existence. Their cold stares served as a reminder of the cost of change. Jake wasn't surprised. He had known this would happen. His popularity, built on fear and dominance, had crumbled the moment he chose to stand beside Eli. But the thing that surprised him was that he didn't care as much as he thought he would. The approval he once craved seemed hollow now. What mattered more was proving to Eli, to the school, and to himself that he wasn't the person he used to be. Eli walked beside him, quiet as always, but Jake could feel the difference. The air between them was lighter, no more guarded glances or forced conversations. They weren't just partners in a project anymore. They were something more than that. Allies, friends. And that friendship gave Jake a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Days turned into weeks. Jake and Eli's story had spread throughout the school. They were no longer just two names on a class project. They had become symbols of something bigger. Mr. Reynolds approached them with an idea, a program called Rise Up, designed to help integrate students who had experienced bullying or were new to the school, especially those from different backgrounds. Jake hesitated when Mr. Reynolds first suggested it. He wasn't sure if he deserved to lead something like that, but Eli's quiet confidence pushed him forward. Together, they started small. One meeting after school, a handful of students who felt out of place. But soon, the numbers grew. More and more students came, sharing their stories, finding common ground. Jake watched as Eli spoke to them with ease, offering words of comfort and wisdom that came from deep pain and resilience. Jake contributed too, not as a leader dictating the room, but as someone learning alongside them. Rise Up became more than a program. It became a movement. Stories of overcoming adversity spread, bridging gaps between students who might never have spoken otherwise. For the first time in a long while, Jefferson High felt different, less divided, more human. Ashley, who had always believed Jake was capable of more, joined them in organizing events. "Never thought I'd see you here, Jake," she teased during one meeting, her smile genuine. "Guess you're full of surprises." Jake smiled back. "Guess I had to stop hiding behind a jersey first." Their laughter was easy, natural. The walls Jake had built around himself for years had finally come down, brick by brick, but change never came without resistance. Tyler and the others still lingered in the background, watching with critical eyes. Jake knew that winning them over wasn't the goal anymore. He wasn't looking for their approval, yet deep down, he wondered if they would ever understand. If they could. That question lingered one afternoon when Tyler approached him in the hallway. The tension was immediate. Students nearby slowed their steps, sensing something brewing. Jake stopped, standing tall but calm. Tyler didn't smirk this time. His expression was harder to read, less mocking, more uncertain. "You really think one little program makes up for all the crap you pulled?" Tyler's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Jake didn't flinch. "No," he said simply. "It doesn't. But it's a start." For a long moment, Tyler said nothing, then he shook his head and walked away. Jake let him go. He didn't chase after approval anymore. Later that evening, as Jake and Eli packed up after another successful meeting of Rise Up, Jake turned to Eli. "You think they'll ever get it? People like Tyler?" Eli paused, thinking. "Maybe, maybe not. But they don't have to. You're not doing this for them." Jake nodded slowly. Eli was right. The work wasn't about changing minds that refused to change. It was about helping those who needed it, offering the kind of support Jake wished he'd had when he felt powerless. Together, they had turned something ugly into something hopeful. As they locked up the classroom, Jake realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of pretending. The guilt wasn't gone, but it didn't control him anymore. Because now, he was doing something that mattered. And for once, Jake Thompson felt like he deserved to hold his head high. 10 years had passed. The echoes of Jefferson High School's hallways were now distant memories, but for Jake Thompson and Eli Morales, those years remained a defining chapter. Life had moved forward, new places, new faces, new responsibilities, but the lessons they learned together had never faded. Jake stood backstage at a national conference on youth empowerment, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. The sound of murmuring voices filled the massive auditorium beyond the curtain. Hundreds had gathered, teachers, students, and community leaders, all, there to hear stories about resilience and transformation. Jake took a deep breath, his reflection staring back at him from a nearby mirror. He barely recognized the boy he used to be, the one who hid behind a football jersey and a toxic reputation. The man standing there now had earned his respect, not through popularity, but through purpose. Eli appeared beside him, calm as always, dressed simply but confidently. His presence was still steady, still grounding. Over the years, Eli had become a respected counselor for refugee children, helping them navigate trauma with the same quiet strength he once showed at Jefferson High. "Ready?" Eli asked, offering a small, familiar smile. Jake nodded. "Always easier when you're beside me." Eli gave him a look. "We've come a long way, huh?" Jake chuckled. "Yeah, feels like a lifetime ago." The stage lights brightened, signaling it was time. The host introduced them, recounting how Jake and Eli had turned a story of bullying into a movement of change. The applause rose as they stepped onto the stage. Jake looked out at the sea of faces. He wasn't nervous. Not this time. This was where he belonged. Jake approached the microphone, pausing as the crowd quieted. "If you'd told me 10 years ago that I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed you," he began, his voice steady. "Back then, I thought I had it all figured out. Popularity, success, control. But the truth was, I was lost. I hurt people because I didn't know how to face my own pain." His eyes found Eli standing off to the side, listening closely. "And then I met someone who showed me what real strength looked like, not with fists or words, but through forgiveness." Jake paused, glancing back at Eli. "Eli Morales survived things I couldn't even imagine. I tried to break him, but he taught me how to be whole. He didn't just forgive me, he showed me how to forgive myself." The auditorium remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jake stepped back from the microphone. "Eli," he said, motioning for his friend to join him. "Come up here." The audience erupted in applause as Eli walked forward. Standing side by side, the two men faced the crowd. Eli looked at Jake for a moment, then turned to the audience. "Sometimes," Eli said, his voice calm but powerful, "the people who try to break you are the ones who need healing the most. Forgiveness isn't just a gift for them, it's a gift for yourself." He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Because when you let go of hate, you make space for something better, for growth, for friendship." The crowd rose to its feet in applause, louder, more genuine than anything Jake had ever heard during his days at Jefferson High. But this wasn't about popularity. It wasn't about being the center of attention. This was about something real, something earned. The two men stood there together, letting the moment sink in. Jake glanced at Eli and smiled. "Guess we did okay, huh?" Eli returned the smile. "We did more than okay." The lights dimmed, and on the screen behind them, a simple message appeared. A story of forgiveness, a story of strength, a story of hope. As the crowd continued to applaud, Jake realized this wasn't just the end of their story. It was the beginning of countless others. Stories of kids who would stand up instead of stand by. Stories of change, redemption, and healing. And somewhere in all those stories, the lessons Jake and Eli had learned would live on. They had broken the cycle. They had risen above the pain. Together, they had proved that even the most broken pieces could be put back together, and that sometimes forgiveness wasn't just about the person you gave it to, but the person you became because of it.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.